The moment Senator John Kennedy interrupted Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the room shifted in a way no one had anticipated, not with anger or theatrics, but with a quiet tension that felt heavier than shouting ever could. She had been in full stride, delivering one of those carefully sculpted speeches that blended urgency with optimism, painting climate change as the defining moral test of the generation. The Democrats on the panel leaned back in their chairs with approving nods, the cameras lingering on her face, capturing the expressions that would soon be clipped for social media. Then Kennedy spoke, his voice calm, slow, almost casual, and instead of challenging her beliefs, he asked something far simpler. How much does it cost? For a brief second, Ocasio-Cortez smiled, assuming this was just another predictable Republican jab that she could redirect with practiced ease. She tried to pivot toward morality, toward responsibility, toward the cost of doing nothing. But Kennedy didn't raise his voice or sharpen his tone. He simply asked again, as if he were trying to understand a grocery bill rather than the largest policy proposal in modern American politics. It wasn't hostile, and that was precisely what made it uncomfortable. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. Kennedy framed his question as personal, even neighborly, explaining that the people he represented worked long hours, paid their taxes, and wanted to know what they were being asked to fund. He said he cared about faith, about ethics, about doing the right thing, but he also sat on the Senate Budget Committee, where numbers mattered as much as ideals. The more he spoke, the more he positioned himself not as an opponent, but as someone genuinely seeking clarification. Ocasio-Cortez shifted in her seat, visibly recalculating her approach. She hadn't come prepared with a number because the plan itself had never been designed around one. When Kennedy cited outside estimates suggesting costs in the tens of trillions, she dismissed them as politically motivated. He didn't argue. He just asked what her number was instead. She declined to engage with what she described as bad faith calculations, and he responded by insisting that arithmetic itself wasn't partisan. The exchange stayed polite, but the contrast was stark. She spoke in values. He spoke in totals. The cameras caught every pause. Kennedy leaned into the role of the confused lawmaker, flipping through documents and asking which assumptions were wrong. Was it the cost of retrofitting buildings, the expense of replacing fossil fuels, the price of expanding infrastructure? He didn't claim the figures were perfect. He invited her to correct them, but correcting them required data she didn't have on hand. Each unanswered question made the room feel smaller. When the discussion turned to funding, Ocasio-Cortez mentioned progressive taxation, wealth taxes, and modern monetary theory. Kennedy listened without interruption and then responded with examples from economic history, not as accusations, but as reminders of what inflation had done in other countries. He asked whether printing enormous sums could realistically avoid consequences. She avoided a direct answer, emphasizing that economic models were more complex than he suggested. He replied that complexity didn't erase basic principles. The exchange remained civil, yet the imbalance grew more obvious with each minute. Kennedy spoke like someone walking through a spreadsheet. Ocasio-Cortez spoke like someone delivering a manifesto. Both styles had their audience, but in a budget hearing the contrast felt unusually sharp. Even sympathetic senators began looking down at their notes. No one rushed to rescue her. Then Kennedy changed direction, shifting from national spending to local decisions, including her opposition to the Amazon headquarters deal in New York. He framed it as a practical example of economic trade-offs, listing projected jobs, wages, and tax revenue. He asked how rejecting those numbers aligned with her claims of fighting for working people. Ocasio-Cortez responded with concerns about displacement and corporate welfare, language familiar from her past interviews. Kennedy countered by pointing out that lost revenue couldn't fund community programs that never materialized. Again, he avoided accusation and stuck to comparisons, asking which scenario produced more tangible benefits. Her answers emphasized symbolism and long-term justice. His emphasized immediate consequences. The hearing wasn't turning into a shouting match, but it was becoming something more damaging. It looked like a mismatch of preparation. And mismatches don't need insults to feel humiliating. As the questioning continued, Kennedy turned toward lifestyle and public image, not as a moral attack, but as a contrast between rhetoric and reality. He mentioned luxury events, high-end housing, and the optics of campaigning against elites while appearing among them. She defended her presence as representational, as using platforms to send messages. He replied that messages lose credibility when they come wrapped in privilege. The room stayed quiet, as if no one wanted to touch that line of argument. Kennedy then returned to economics, reminding her of her degree and asking whether she accepted certain foundational concepts. He framed his questions like a professor, not a prosecutor. What happens when wages rise beyond what small businesses can afford? What happens when government spending expands faster than productivity? Her responses stressed moral responsibility and systemic reform. Kennedy acknowledged those goals but insisted that every policy created winners and losers. He argued that ignoring trade-offs didn't make them disappear. The more he spoke, the more his folksy style faded into something firmer, though still restrained. He wasn't mocking her intelligence, he was questioning her readiness. And that distinction mattered. The emotional peak came when he asked whether she genuinely believed the Green New Deal, as written, was fully achievable or primarily symbolic. The question landed heavier than any statistic. It forced a choice between realism and aspiration. She answered with language about trying, about striving, about urgency. Kennedy responded that national budgets couldn't be built on hope alone. He said he admired her passion, but worried about the absence of operational detail. He spoke about governance as an obligation to confront uncomfortable math, not just inspiring visions. He suggested that serious policy required more than slogans, even noble ones. When he yielded his time, the room felt deflated, not hostile, just exhausted. Afterward, the narrative formed almost on its own. Clips circulated showing her pausing, deflecting, recalibrating. Clips of Kennedy asking the same question in different ways. The viral moment wasn't cruelty. It was repetition. And repetition is unforgiving. Commentators argued over whether it was fair to demand detailed budgets from a resolution rather than legislation. Supporters said she was being held to unrealistic standards. Critics said leadership meant anticipating those standards. The debate wasn't about climate change itself, but about competence and preparation. And competence is harder to spin than ideology. Ocasio-Cortez went on friendly networks, emphasizing moral urgency and systemic obstacles. But every interviewer echoed Kennedy's central question: how much does it cost, and how do you pay for it? The answers stayed broad, philosophical, careful not to commit. Carefulness looked like evasion. Within weeks, even allies began qualifying their support, saying they favored ambitious climate action but needed clearer numbers. The Green New Deal didn't disappear, but it lost momentum. It became a vision rather than a roadmap. Kennedy hadn't disproven the goal, he had exposed the gaps. And gaps invite doubt. Years later, political science students would watch that hearing not as a battle of personalities, but as a lesson in framing. Kennedy never attacked her motives, and she never attacked his character. Yet the outcome felt lopsided, because one side spoke in narratives while the other spoke in arithmetic. Neither approach was inherently wrong, but only one aligned with the setting. Budget rooms reward calculators more than poets. Ocasio-Cortez remained influential, vocal, and popular with her base, but her reputation shifted subtly. She was seen less as a policy architect and more as a symbolic leader. Kennedy, meanwhile, gained a reputation for dismantling ideas with calm persistence, not through insults, but through patience. And patience can be devastating. The hearing became a reference point in political commentary, not for who was right about climate, but for how power works in public discourse. You can inspire millions with a speech, but a single unanswered question can follow you for years. The exchange showed that credibility isn't just about what you believe, but about what you can explain under pressure. In that room, explanation mattered more than applause. And explanation is where ideals meet reality. What lingered after the cameras shut off wasn't outrage or even partisan celebration, but a kind of low-grade unease that settled over the political class. It wasn't that Kennedy had won in any dramatic sense, and it wasn't that Ocasio-Cortez had been humiliated beyond recovery. It was that the exchange felt uncomfortably familiar to anyone who had ever watched politics drift away from mechanics and toward performance. The hearing didn't expose a villain. It exposed a gap between ambition and execution. And that gap is where most modern political projects quietly die. In the days that followed, the reaction split along predictable lines. Progressive activists argued that Kennedy had weaponized procedural detail to derail transformative ideas. Conservative commentators framed it as proof that progressive economics couldn't survive basic scrutiny. But beneath the tribal arguments, a more subtle question circulated among people who weren't particularly ideological at all. If someone proposes to reshape the entire economy, shouldn't they be able to explain the price tag? That question didn't accuse Ocasio-Cortez of bad faith, corruption, or incompetence in a personal sense. It challenged something more abstract: the culture of modern political messaging, the kind that prioritizes emotional resonance over logistical planning, the kind that treats policy as a narrative rather than a system. And in that culture, numbers are often seen as optional. The Green New Deal had always existed in a strange space between aspiration and legislation. Supporters described it as a vision, a starting point, a moral framework. Critics treated it as a literal blueprint for government action. Both interpretations were partly correct, and that ambiguity had been useful. Until someone asked for a calculator. Kennedy didn't dismantle the idea of climate action. He didn't even argue that the Green New Deal was morally wrong. What he did was force the conversation into a domain that activists often avoid: trade-offs. Who pays, who benefits, who absorbs the risk, and who loses in the transition? These aren't inspiring questions, but they decide whether ideas survive contact with reality. Ocasio-Cortez, for her part, seemed caught between two roles she had spent years balancing. On one hand, she was a movement figure, expected to speak in moral absolutes. On the other, she was a legislator, expected to operate within bureaucratic constraints. The hearing exposed how difficult it is to perform both functions at once. Movements thrive on clarity. Governance thrives on compromise. The public response reflected that tension. Some viewers admired her refusal to reduce complex problems to simple numbers. Others interpreted her reluctance as a lack of preparation. Neither interpretation required hostility, yet both shaped perception. In politics, perception often matters more than intent, and perception is rarely forgiving. What made the moment resonate wasn't just the content of the questions, but their tone. Kennedy didn't accuse, he inquired. He didn't raise his voice. He lowered expectations. He framed himself as the person who didn't understand, which subtly forced her into the role of teacher. And when the teacher couldn't answer, the lesson collapsed. That dynamic is powerful because it doesn't rely on aggression. It relies on contrast, between certainty and hesitation, between spreadsheets and speeches, between ideals and implementation. In another context, Ocasio-Cortez's style might have dominated. On a rally stage or in a televised town hall, moral framing plays well. But in a budget committee, moral framing competes with fiscal accounting. One inspires applause, the other shapes policy. And applause doesn't fund infrastructure. What followed the hearing wasn't a dramatic downfall, but a slow recalibration. Progressive leaders became more cautious in how they referenced the Green New Deal. Language shifted from endorsement to supporting the principles. Candidates talked about climate goals without attaching themselves to specific numbers. It wasn't a retreat, exactly, but it wasn't an advance either. Ocasio-Cortez continued to influence discourse, but her role subtly changed. She became less the architect of sweeping policy and more the symbol of a political generation. A figure who defined what people should care about, even if others decided how to implement it. That's not a small role, but it's different from legislative leadership. And the difference matters inside institutions built on procedure. Kennedy's reputation also shifted, though in a quieter way. He wasn't suddenly seen as a climate expert or a policy visionary. He became known as someone who could puncture rhetoric without looking cruel. Someone who understood that questions, when asked patiently, can be more destabilizing than arguments. In a polarized environment, patience looks almost radical. The hearing became a case study in political communication, not because of its drama, but because of its restraint. No one stormed out. No one accused the other of treason or malice. Yet the consequences were real. It showed that tone can be a form of power. There's a lesson here that extends beyond these two figures. Modern politics rewards spectacle, but governance punishes vagueness. Campaigns run on emotion, but institutions run on paperwork. Movements thrive on belief, but budgets thrive on limits. And when those worlds collide, something has to give. The exchange also highlighted a deeper discomfort within progressive politics itself. Many supporters of ambitious reforms are aware, at least subconsciously, that the math is daunting. They hope that political will can substitute for economic constraint, that urgency can override feasibility, that moral necessity can bend arithmetic. But arithmetic doesn't bend easily. It can be delayed, reinterpreted, reframed, but not erased. At some point, someone has to decide which programs get funded and which don't, which taxes get raised and which constituencies absorb the cost. Those decisions are inherently unpopular, and that's why they're often postponed. Ocasio-Cortez's reluctance to specify numbers wasn't unusual. Most politicians avoid precise commitments for exactly the same reason. Specifics create accountability. Vagueness preserves flexibility. And flexibility is politically safer than precision. The difference in this case was scale. Proposing incremental change allows room for ambiguity. Proposing systemic transformation invites scrutiny. The larger the promise, the harder it is to avoid details. And the Green New Deal promised almost everything. The hearing didn't prove that climate action is impossible. It didn't even prove that large-scale reform can't work. What it did prove is that rhetoric alone can't carry the weight of structural change. At some point, visions must be translated into budgets, and budgets require uncomfortable honesty. That's why the moment lingered. Not because it exposed hypocrisy or scandal, but because it revealed how often politics operates in two parallel realities. One where ideas live as symbols, and another where they live as line items. The hearing forced those realities to meet. For Ocasio-Cortez, the long-term impact wasn't career-ending. She remained influential, visible, and culturally relevant. But the aura of policy inevitability faded. She became a voice of aspiration rather than implementation, a role that carries attention but limited institutional power. For Kennedy, the moment reinforced a strategy that suited his style. Ask simple questions, avoid dramatic claims, let others struggle with their own proposals. In a media environment addicted to outrage, understatement becomes disarming. The broader political system absorbed the lesson quietly. Ambitious proposals became more carefully framed. Language shifted from certainty to exploration, from declarations to working groups, from promises to pilot programs. Not because politicians suddenly became cautious by nature, but because one well-placed question had shown how fragile grand narratives can be. When stripped of supportive slogans, when isolated from ideological echo chambers, when confronted by someone pretending not to understand. The hearing didn't end the conversation about climate, inequality, or economic reform. It simply changed how those conversations were conducted. Numbers became unavoidable. Trade-offs became harder to ignore, and moral language had to coexist with fiscal language. That coexistence remains uncomfortable. It always will be. Politics is easier when problems are framed as battles between good and bad. It's harder when they're framed as equations with limited solutions. But equations are what governments actually solve. In that sense, the exchange between Kennedy and Ocasio-Cortez wasn't about who was right. It was about what kind of politics people want to live with. One built on inspiration, or one built on calculation. Ideally both, but rarely at the same time, and rarely in the same person. The lasting image from the hearing wasn't anger or defeat. It was hesitation. A pause where certainty should have been. And in politics, hesitation speaks louder than any speech. That hesitation became a kind of silent punctuation mark in the story, the moment everyone remembered not what was said, but what wasn't. In political memory, unanswered questions linger longer than wrong answers. A wrong answer can be debated, corrected, or reframed. No answer just sits there, waiting for someone else to fill the space. And once that space exists, it never really closes. Over time, the hearing stopped being referenced as a confrontation and started being referenced as a turning point. Not a turning point in ideology, but in tone. It marked a subtle shift from the era of viral soundbites to the era of forced specificity. Politicians on both sides began preparing for the kind of questions Kennedy had asked. Not because they admired him, but because they didn't want to be him or her in that chair. Staffers across Washington quietly updated their briefing books. Proposals that once relied on broad moral framing suddenly included backup spreadsheets. Campaign slogans were accompanied by internal memos full of caveats. The public never saw those documents, but the fear of another "how much does it cost" moment reshaped how people spoke behind closed doors. Silence had become expensive. For Ocasio-Cortez, the challenge wasn't that she lacked intelligence or commitment. It was that she had built her political identity around being ahead of the conversation. She introduced ideas before institutions were ready to process them. That made her powerful in shaping discourse, but it also meant she often arrived at hearings with narratives instead of toolkits. There's a difference between leading a movement and managing a system. Movements ask what should be. Systems ask what can be. Ocasio-Cortez had mastered the first question and stumbled on the second. Kennedy lived almost entirely inside the second. The contrast wasn't ideological so much as operational. She spoke like someone trying to open a door. He spoke like someone checking whether the hinges could support the weight. Both roles matter, but only one determines whether the door stays open. The American political environment rarely rewards that distinction. Voters are drawn to vision, not logistics. They remember who inspired them, not who balanced the spreadsheet. But institutions remember the opposite. They remember who showed up, prepared to negotiate details. That's why the hearing felt unsettling to so many observers. It revealed how much of modern political culture operates on borrowed time. Ideas move faster than systems can absorb them. Public enthusiasm outpaces bureaucratic capacity. And eventually, someone asks the unglamorous question: how do we actually do this? That question doesn't kill ideas, but it tests them. Some survive by adapting. Others collapse under their own weight. The Green New Deal didn't vanish, but it fragmented. It turned into dozens of smaller proposals, pilot programs, and research initiatives. In practical terms, that was probably inevitable. No single resolution could realistically restructure energy, labor, housing, healthcare, and education all at once. But the symbolic version had been useful. It gave activists something to rally around. It gave politicians a banner to stand under. Kennedy's questions didn't destroy the banner. They just forced people to admit that a banner isn't a blueprint. And that admission changed the conversation more than any insult ever could. Ocasio-Cortez eventually adjusted her approach. She still spoke in moral language, but she started bringing economists and policy analysts into her media appearances. She framed proposals as experiments rather than guarantees. She emphasized direction over destination. It wasn't a retreat, but it was a recalibration. Some supporters saw this as growth, others saw it as dilution, but it reflected a deeper reality. The system had pushed back, not with hostility, but with inertia. And inertia is harder to fight than opposition. Kennedy, meanwhile, never became a hero or villain in the mainstream sense. He remained a secondary figure in national politics, but his role in that hearing entered political folklore, not as a viral moment, but as a methodological one. It became shorthand for a style of critique. Whenever a politician proposed something sweeping, someone would inevitably say, "This feels like another Kennedy question," meaning, where's the math? Not as a partisan attack, but as a procedural reflex. It was the political equivalent of asking for footnotes. And once footnotes are expected, grand narratives become harder to maintain. This didn't make politics more honest or less dramatic. It just changed the shape of the drama. Instead of emotional confrontations, there were quiet audits. Instead of viral takedowns, there were leaked spreadsheets. Instead of slogans, there were cost projections with asterisks. The public rarely paid attention to those details, but their existence influenced what eventually reached the floor for a vote. Policies became narrower, more incremental, more defensible. Ambition didn't disappear, but it learned to hide inside feasibility studies. Vision learned to speak in the language of constraints. That shift disappointed some activists who wanted bold declarations. They saw caution as betrayal. They saw compromise as surrender. But institutions rarely move at the speed of outrage. They move at the speed of paperwork. And paperwork has its own politics. It rewards patience, technical knowledge, and the ability to negotiate trade-offs without turning them into moral crusades. Those skills don't trend on social media. They don't produce dramatic clips. But they determine what becomes law. The hearing between Kennedy and Ocasio-Cortez didn't settle any ideological debates. Climate change remained urgent. Economic inequality remained unresolved. But it introduced a kind of procedural skepticism into the conversation. A reminder that no matter how urgent a problem feels, solutions still have to pass through accounting. That reminder is uncomfortable because it feels cold. Numbers don't care about justice. Budgets don't respond to passion. Yet governments operate entirely within those structures, and ignoring them doesn't make them go away. In hindsight, the moment seems less like a defeat and more like a collision between two political realities. One driven by narrative and urgency, the other driven by structure and limitation. Neither can fully replace the other. But when they clash, structure usually wins by default. Ocasio-Cortez's long-term influence remained cultural more than legislative. She shaped what people talked about. She influenced which problems felt morally unavoidable. But others shaped how those problems were translated into law. Her role became that of a catalyst rather than an engineer. Kennedy's role remained largely invisible to the public. He didn't define agendas. He didn't inspire movements. But he embodied a kind of institutional memory, the voice that asks whether ideas can survive inside the machine. That machine doesn't care who you are or how many followers you have. It cares whether your proposal can be audited, funded, implemented, and defended. It cares about compliance, not charisma. It cares about solvency, not symbolism. And when those priorities surface, politics feels very different. The deeper lesson of the hearing wasn't about either individual. It was about the system itself. A system that rewards vision at the campaign stage and punishes vagueness at the governing stage. A system that invites people to dream and then forces them to file expense reports. A system that thrives on ambition but runs on limits. That tension will never disappear. Every generation produces leaders who want to rewrite the rules. Every institution produces guardians who enforce them. Sometimes the dreamers win. More often, the accountants do. What made this moment memorable wasn't who spoke better or who had better arguments. It was that the exchange felt oddly honest. No one lied. No one exaggerated beyond the usual political margins. They simply spoke from different operating systems. One asked, "What kind of world should we live in?" The other asked, "What kind of world can we afford?" Those questions rarely get answered in the same room. When they do, the silence between them says more than any speech ever could. In the end, the exchange wasn't remembered as a scandal or a collapse, but as a quiet lesson in how power actually functions when the cameras stop flattering and start observing. It showed that politics isn't only about who has the best ideas, but about who can translate those ideas into something that survives contact with reality. Vision may open the conversation, but structure decides whether it continues. The moment didn't destroy careers or create heroes. It simply revealed the difference between speaking to the future and managing the present. Ocasio-Cortez remained a symbol of urgency, a voice that reminded people what was at stake. Kennedy remained a symbol of constraint, a voice that reminded people what was possible. Neither role was inherently superior, but they existed in constant tension. That tension is the real story. It's the tension between hope and limit, between aspiration and accounting, between what people want and what systems can absorb. Every political generation faces it in one form or another. Some pretend it doesn't exist. Others learn to live inside it. The hearing mattered not because someone won, but because it exposed how fragile political certainty can be when stripped of its emotional armor. It suggested that confidence without calculation is just performance, and calculation without purpose is just bureaucracy. Real governance happens somewhere in the uncomfortable space between the two. Years from now, most people won't remember the exact questions or the exact answers. They'll remember the pause, the hesitation where a definitive number should have been, the moment when rhetoric slowed down and reality caught up. And maybe that's the most honest thing politics ever produces. Not a solution, not a victory, but a reminder that even the loudest ideas eventually have to pass through silence before they become real.